Hello, and thank you for joining with me as I begin to explore with you over a number of weeks the life and teachings of St. Paul. Paul is an amazing character. If one was to pick up one's Bible and turn to the contents of the New Testament, you would find that Paul is responsible for, or at least it's attributed to, almost half the books in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. It shows the importance of this man. Looking at my contents page for my Bible, we think about the book of Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians, Timothy, Titus, Philemon. All are attributed to or written by St. Paul. And you'll notice I'm not saying all are written by St. Paul, but some of them are given his name, although scholars now think that some of them were written by those who were his followers, that Paul himself didn't write it. But at least 7 of these books are written in their entirety by Paul, either handwriting, but more likely dictating to someone who would write the words so that he could send letters to the various churches. But we'll get to that as time goes on. At the end of Paul's ministry, in his last visit to Jerusalem, Paul is arrested. He would be taken eventually to Rome, where he'd be tried, and eventually he would be executed there. But when he's arrested in Jerusalem, people think he's somebody else. And he says, I'm a Jew, born at Tarsus in the Roman province of Cilicia, a citizen of a very important city. And that's where we're going to start thinking about it. But I want to sum up Paul, and I'm grateful to the book called Paul by John Drain, who has taken Paul's own words from the various parts of Scripture and has written this summary of Paul. I'm a Jew, born at Tarsus in the Roman province of Cilicia, a citizen of a very important city. My upbringing was thoroughly Jewish in every way. I was also particularly fortunate in being born into a family on which Roman citizenship had been conferred, and I am especially proud of this privilege. I was educated in the city of Jerusalem at the school of the famous teacher Gamaliel, according to the strictest interpretation of the Jewish law, as laid down by the Pharisees. I was so zealous for the traditions of my people that I soon advanced in my religious faith far beyond most of my contemporaries. I could even claim to be almost faultless in my obedience to the Old Testament law. These are Paul's own words, and you can find them in the book of Acts at chapter 21 at verse 39, or 22 at verse 3, or 22 at verse 28. You can find them in the letter to the Galatians at chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, or Philippians at chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. So Paul is from a town called Tarsus. And hopefully, if I can work out the technology, I'm going to put up a map which will show you where Tarsus was. It was quite a journey from Jerusalem. It wasn't actually in Israel. It was in a Roman province, as we said in his own words, of Cilicia. The town is not that important town now in Turkey. But in Paul's day, it was a thriving city. It was a capital of the region of Cilicia, which was a Roman province. But although it was a Roman city and a Roman capital under Roman authority, much of its influences were Greek. It was Hellenistic in its approach to life. It was a city of important trading. It was near the sea. It wasn't on the sea, but it was on a river that was connected to the sea, the river Tarsus. And it was an important port. It was a place where people would sell their goods and transport them through the Roman Empire. It also had a great Greek culture background. And even though Paul, or Saul as he was then, was brought up as a strict Jew, there can be no doubt that the Greek influences had some bearing on him. You could not shut yourself away in a city so cosmopolitan as Tarsus was. It also boasted a great library. Indeed, one of the early historians in his geography almost equated Athens, and we can imagine what Athens was like in its peak, and Tarsus in the same breath. It was a very famous and influential city. And that's where Paul was born. Because he came from Tarsus, he was granted, because it was a free city, Roman citizenship. And that would play a part in his life. The fact that as a Roman citizen, he could travel anywhere in the Roman Empire. But more of that later on in the weeks to come. It says in his own words that he was born at Tarsus, but he was educated in the city of Jerusalem, and at the feet of one of the most famous teachers, and I can never pronounce his name correctly, Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the prime teacher, the most important of the Jewish teachers of the day. He came from, well, a kind of liberalish wing of the Jewish tradition, and he taught in Jerusalem. And Saul, as he was, Saul must have been a very bright and able scholar. We can tell that by his writings, we can tell that by what he taught us later on, but he must have been driven, and so his folks must have been driven too, because perhaps when he was quite young, he would have given up his childhood in Tarsus and gone to Jerusalem. Maybe his parents went there. We don't really know. But as Tarsus was still a home for him in various stages of his journey of life, it strikes me that probably he went there to be educated, not as a family to live. His education was a strict Jewish education. It was to learn the law. It was to learn the scriptures. And in these days, the scriptures were on big rolls, rolled up, and in various bits. So you didn't go around carrying the scriptures with you as we would do carrying a Bible. So people learned the scriptures. And it's argued that Paul could recite almost all of the scriptures. He would be able to say in the early part of Genesis, or the writings of Jeremiah or Isaiah or whatever, he would remember them. A gift that I've never had. I've never learned scripture verses. Indeed, if somebody quotes a verse to me and they'll say, "Where is that in the Bible?" Unlike some of my colleagues and other people, they'll be able to tell you, I've never been able to do that. But you would bet your bottom dollar that Paul would have been able to do that. And not just recite it, he would be able to understand it. And so Paul has an important grounding, an important basis for what he would later become. And it's important to recognise how driven Paul was. Nobody becomes a scholar of the great scholars of the day unless you're driven. Natural intelligence only goes so far. It's like, if I'm honest, some of the footballers that I've seen over the years who have been young men who have been brilliant, but didn't have the drive, didn't have the dedication. They had to work hard, and they didn't want to work hard. They thought it was God's given gift, so they wouldn't work hard. And as a result, their careers didn't go as well as those who worked hard at their skills. Paul, or Saul, would have worked hard. He would have done a lot. And one of the traditions of the time was that those training, those sitting in these, let's just call them religious schools, they had to learn a trade. And Paul became a tent maker. A tent maker, working with leather and cloth, was an important skill, because we imagine all of these towns and cities that we think about, but many of them required the skills of tent makers. People still lived in some places nomadic lives. This would be a skill that would stay with Paul all his days, as he was able to fund his ministry, as it were. He didn't believe, in fact, the scripture tells us that he believed that those who were doing God's work should pay their own way and not be dependent upon others. I'm suddenly starting to get a wee bit frightened here, because I depend on your support to fund my ministry. Paul would use his skills. He would move from place to place, and maybe in a quiet moment he would help fund his ministry, although we know nothing about that from the scriptures. But Paul has to be understood, and it can't be stressed enough, was a Jew. And he was proud to be a Jew. He was also proud of Tarsus. As he said at the end in that response to his arrest in Jerusalem, "I'm from Tarsus, a very important city." So Paul is raised in Tarsus. He's educated in Jerusalem. You know, I've been speaking about Paul and his studies, and I was just reaching over for something, and I just thought to myself how important and how easy it is for us to have a Bible of our own in a language that we can speak. Behind my shoulder, stuck on a wall that you can't see, is a poster from the Bible Society, and it speaks about different Bibles and different productions of Bibles around the world. And it's an important little poster to remind me of the work that the Bible Societies around the world do in producing scriptures so that people can hear it in their own language. Because, as we know, the Bible wasn't written in English. The Bible, original Old Testament, was written in Hebrew, and the New Testament in Greek. And the young Saul, or Paul, he would have probably had, as I say, not a Bible as such, but his original scriptures would probably have been a version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. This is a Greek edition of the Old Testament. The Old Testament had been translated from the original Hebrew by Jewish scholars living in Alexandria in Egypt, where there was a famous library. And it was translated about 150 years before Paul was born. We sometimes call it the LXX, meaning 50, because it's meaning 70, because tradition says there were 70 scholars who translated it. And this is the version that most Jewish people living in Palestine used, that version of the Old Testament. So the Greek influence, the language, would be coming through. He wouldn't have studied Greek philosophy in terms of the ancient teachings of the Greek philosophers, but he would have learned the Greek language, and he would have heard it spoken. It was the language of the common people in that town of Tarsus, and it was that he would have originally learned. Probably when he went to Jerusalem, there'd be more returning to the original, a bit like but not really like. But my only comparison is when I went to university to study divinity. In my first year, I was shocked that I could learn the original language of Hebrew and Greek to read the scriptures, and some of my colleagues and friends made a brilliant job of it. I managed to last 2 weeks studying Hebrew before it just made my head explode, and I gave it up. I did manage to get first year Greek, but more because one of my wonderful late professors, Professor Howard Marshall, used to take me into his office at lunchtimes to go over the Greek over and over to help me pass that credit in my degree. Paul would have started to hear more of the Hebrew when he was in Jerusalem. Of that, I'm pretty sure. So young Paul is grounded in a Greek city, but in that Greek city with a Jewish almost conclave of people, a Jewish settlement. There would have been a bit like the centres that we think about. We think about the horrible purges of the Jewish communities in Nazi Germany and Poland and other places where the people all lived together or were corralled together. Paul would more likely have been in such a community of like-minded people. The Jewish sector, we'll call it for lack of a better phrase. But he would have had these influences of all of the traditions and the movement of people, the people coming from the boats for the buying and selling in the markets, for the wonderful traditions of Greek culture that were in that city, the people at the university studying the world. And so all of these influences played a part. And so this young, eager-minded, determined young boy with that background would go and start to study at the feet of the great scholar Gamaliel. And it must have really impacted greatly on his life as he began to take on board all of this teaching, having it explored and challenged what the actual words, because it was all right being able to repeat the scriptures. As I said, he had memorized huge parts of the Bible. It was all right being able to quote the scriptures. And I say this to people nowadays, it's all right being able to quote the scriptures. That counts for nothing if you don't know how it impacts on your life. This morning I was at a meeting with friends, and we actually were discussing Vladimir Putin. And one of my colleagues and friends said that he apparently goes to chapel every day, and he's a devout Christian of the Orthodox Church. He maybe knows the words, but does he know what they mean? Does he know what it means to love one's neighbour? And so Saul would be taught how to expand and explore these words. And he became part of a group called the Pharisees, who were more, how would you say it, working class, more ordinary people who were bright, who were scholars, who became leaders in the communities, who were strictly orthodox in terms of they didn't break the Jewish law. You know, what did I say right at the start? This is Paul's own words, I was so zealous for the traditions of my people that I soon advanced in my religious faith, far beyond most of my contemporaries. I could even claim to be almost faultless in my obedience to the Old Testament law. Almost faultless. Do you know, I have to say, and I'll maybe look at this later on, sometimes when I read Paul, I think, what an arrogant person he was. So full of himself. And maybe he had right to. But sometimes it just seems a wee bit that, almost faultless. Well, I'm almost faultless. I wish. I know that I'm almost good. Not almost faultless. but he followed the rules. He went out of his way to follow not just the rules, not just the scriptures, but as I've said to my churches and I've said on other sites online, Paul, the Jewish tradition was based not just on following the laws, but following the laws that were made to save you, to protect you from breaking the laws. So there was all of this other traditions that went with it. And Paul understood all of these. And he would try and impact them and follow them throughout his life, or at least until he had a better understanding on the Damascus Road when he met Christ. But we'll get to that later. So, as we come to the end of this first section about thinking about who Paul was from his early days, Paul was from Tarsus. He was bright and intelligent. He studied the scripture and the traditions in the Pharisaic tone of life. He would learn so much about scripture. His teachings were and he was the top of the class. He was the number one guy. He was proud of the fact that he was such an important person. What did he say? That I soon advanced in my religious faith far beyond most of my contemporaries. I knew much more than them, he would say. And that is the Paul who would become the persecutor of Christ. So next time, after next week, I'm hoping to think about Paul the persecutor. We're going to leave Paul as a young man studying at the feet of Gamaliel. We're going to think of Paul following the traditions of the Pharisees. We're going to think about how he would take that step further and make a name for himself and become so zealous that he would persecute the church. Thanks very much for watching. If you want to pick up any of these, it's worthwhile reading the second half of the Acts of the Apostles, because the Acts of the Apostles, almost half of it is made up of stories of Paul. Some of them seem to contradict others, but you can glean the story of Paul's ministry there. You can also look at it in some of the books some of the letters that he wrote, such as Galatians or Philippians, and get another notion of the man Paul through his teaching. May God bless you. May his face shine upon you and give you peace. Take care of yourself, and in your own way, take care of others.